Hello, I'm Delores Johnson Hurt, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. I was born in Orangeburg, South Carolina. My grandparents were tenant farmers. My father joined the military at an early age and remained serving the United States for 28 years. My mother was a homemaker through most of my high school years. We lived in the city of Orangeburg, South Carolina. We lived on a street that contained a mixed neighborhood. We had white and black families on that street where we lived, called Glover Street. In contrast to our white neighbors who lived in brick or white craftsmen's homes, we lived in a shotgun duplex, would you believe? Actually, a duplex with apartments on two sides, straight through apartments, living room, bedroom, kitchen. And that's how I grew up. I remember that time fondly because I lived there until I was about 4 years old. I remember being somewhat of a tom girl, I'll call myself, being outside in the summer evenings mainly, catching what we call June bugs and putting them in a glass jar and covering that jar up and having them light up the night. I remember going under the house and making mud pies because our houses then were on stilts, sort of. And so I would go outside and make mud pies and do that kind of thing. I was an only child, or the oldest child of 5 children that my parents eventually had. So I was considered, I guess, a little selfish maybe as a child. And so my mother was fortunate to have more financial means than the rest of her sisters with whom we lived. So I remember getting a bicycle, but I was so disappointed that the handlebars were backwards, that kind of thing. But those were idyllic times for me in my mind. We lived in between, as I said, houses of white neighbors. One woman in particular lived next door to us. I didn't feel any sense of racism at that particular age. I wouldn't know if I'd even known about it. But we lived in harmony in downtown Orangeburg, South Carolina. When my father returned from Korea, that's when the moving about began. My father had entered the military because during that time, that was a means of getting ahead. If you were going to stay in small town South Carolina, you weren't going to be able to progress in life. My father was very smart academically, and it was recommended that he attend a boys' school. But because his help was needed on that farm, he was not afforded that opportunity. So I think those kinds of academic genes were passed on to the 5 children that my mother and father had. Whereas my father had academic leanings, my mom's family was the creative side of the family. We have writers in our families. We have artists in our family. So I think there was a nice blend of what each parent had to contribute. My first recollections as a military child was living in Petersburg, Virginia. That was the place where Fort Lee was and is still located. We stayed there for about 3 years. I attended elementary schools in Petersburg, Virginia. My recollections there were that I really liked my first grade teacher. I don't remember any of my other teachers at the time. I enjoyed school. I enjoyed writing my letters. I enjoyed a little girlfriend I had at the time. She would bring to school her sausage and mustard sandwiches, and I just loved them. So I look forward to exchanging my lunch, whatever it was, for her sausage sandwiches. I also had a little crush on a little boy there, whom I don't remember now, but I remember those little crushes that little kids get on each other. Going back to the fact that I was considered a mischievous child, I do remember having to write on that blackboard, "I will not do such and such," as many times as the teacher told us to to write that, to think that the punishment had been enough. So those were the memories I had of my years in Petersburg, Virginia, from ages about 4 to 8.5. When we left Petersburg, Virginia, my father was transferred to Bussac, France, Camp Bussac. Camp Bussac was located not far from a town called Cavignac, and Cavignac is about 70 miles from the large town of Bordeaux, which is in the southern region of France, and there's a very famous wine that's also named after the town of Bordeaux. So we lived in Orangeburg, South Carolina for a year. I attended 4th grade in elementary school there, and then we joined my father in France in May of 1956, I believe. So when we were getting ready to go to France, my mother had 3 of us children at that time, I being the oldest. And what I remember about that trip to the rest of my childhood at that time was that we were allowed, Black family was allowed to ride in a sleeping Pullman car train to New York before we boarded a flight to Europe. I remember that time vividly because my mom had dressed us fastidiously. We were the only Black family on that Pullman train, and we were the only Black family eating in the dining car train at the time. I was going on 9 years old. My 4th grade teacher at the time had given me 2 books. One was Heidi and one was Tom Sawyer. So I remember sitting on that train, riding off to a completely new life. And as we went through that particular experience, my mom looking just fine, her 3 daughters dressed very nicely, I felt for the first time that I felt upper class for the first time. And that was a wonderful feeling based on the fact that in Orangeburg, there was a lot of poverty. And seeing that poverty both then made me feel like I wanted to do something to help our Black people, my Black people, because most of our relatives were there, move up in the world, be able to enjoy life in a way that had not been accorded us, being the products of the tenant farm situation not so long out of slavery, and being repressed and oppressed in as many ways as the major culture could find to have us be. So when we went to France, that was the first time I was in school with white children. It didn't bother me. I mean, children are children until they're taught about differences and taught the prejudices that their families may have. My father and mother chose to live in town rather than on the military base. And we went to school every day in a huge brown military bus. We were transported every day back and forth. My sister and I, Vera, who's 3 years younger than I, and I excelled in school there. I was always one of 1 to 3 Black children in any class that I attended. It was a time that I had little crushes again on one particular boy. But anyway, that's another story. But so I always was in the top 1 or 2 or 3 in all of my classes in school. But there's one incident that I really would like to share that tells you a little bit about how children are affected by being oppressed. One day, shortly after we arrived in France, and my sister and I were riding on a bus, and one little boy called everybody's attention to the fact that I was different, you know, and that I was a Negro. And so I started crying. So one little white girl who became my friend said to me, "Don't cry, Delores. You're not a Negro. You're white, just like us." And I'm saying, because children want to fit in, I sort of felt more accepted because she said that to me, because she told me a lie to make me feel better. At the corner of my eye, I saw my sister Vera looking at me. And that's an incident that I felt so ashamed about that it took me a while to really share that. It was such an incidence of self-denial. And it was something, as I say, shamed me for a long time that I could deny myself. And I think that when you find yourself in situations where you are an only one of a kind, oftentimes you are repressed because you can't express yourself in the way that you'd like to because you want to feel accepted by those who are around you. You can't show your true nature. And because of the way the world is, when you're in that situation of isolation, which I basically felt through much of my childhood, moving into Winthrop College, for example, and being an only one or a first, you really have to be careful to maintain your sense of identity and your sense of culture. That can be very lost otherwise. My parents did not talk about what was going on in the world very much, about the segregated water fountains, the segregated everything, department stores, the lynchings, and all the apartheid of this country that was the norm during those days. I do remember harking back to the Petersburg, Virginia days, though, that my father took a newspaper, I can't remember the name of it, though, out of Baltimore. A very well-known newspaper at the time. And I remember seeing a picture of the dead, bloated body of Emmett Till, and how that picture stayed with me for such a long time, and how traumatic it was, my seeing that picture at such a young age. There were few discussions of the civil rights movement at all in our family, and I think they wanted to protect their children, and that is in large part what they did. When we left France in 1959, and I'm telling my age, I know, but I'm of an âge certain. So at this particular point, why hide who you are and how old you are, So when I left France at the age, I think it was 12 and a half, almost 13, I was this bubbly, about to be teenager who wore pencil skirts and bobby socks. And I was dancing with the handle of the refrigerator. That was the kind of child I was, coming into myself and budding as a teenager, so to speak. However, when we left France and returned to Columbia, South Carolina, I regressed. I literally regressed to being a 9-year-old, the 9-year-old that I had left behind 3 years earlier. And if you looked at photographs of me at that time, you would see the difference. You would see at age 13, let's say, I looked more like a 9-year-old. It wasn't that anything was said. It was just the oppressive air at the time. Nothing was said. It was just I felt the oppression. And that affected me after the freedom we experienced. Being in a country where the French people were not as outwardly racist, would you say, as our countrymen were in the United States. We felt a sense of freedom there. And as you know, many American artists during that period escaped to France because they felt a sense of liberation that France and the French people gave them. Many of the artists of that time went to Paris to live and write. When I returned to Columbia, South Carolina from France, I begged my parents not to return to the South. But I wanted them to go to some place like California. But, folks like to stick to their roots, and that's, I think, what my father wanted to do more than anything else. So we returned to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in Columbia, and there I attended an all-black high school, C.A. Johnson High School in Columbia, South Carolina. But before that, I attended 1 year at the W.A. Perry Middle School. When I got to W.A. Perry Middle School, I was bragging to the kids. I attended an integrated school. I thought I was doing something and saying something. And those kids looked at me. They weren't impressed. And I didn't understand at that point that they had suffered through the sort of segregation that because my parents were in the military, so my father was in the military, we had not really endured. So I felt a pushback. Nothing was said, but there was a pushback, like, so what? So what? They understood and appreciated their families and their roots. But because as a military child, you're uprooted all the time, moving from place to place, or at minimum every 3 years, you don't develop the relationships with your cousins, with your grandparents, with your aunts, You're not rooted in your family's history. And that's what they had that I didn't have. When we were in Columbia, South Carolina, during my high school days, my parents continued to shelter us. We did not go to department stores downtown very often. Maybe once or twice I remember going to a department store downtown to get my prom dress or to get some shoes. But our life basically revolved around being on the military base. We went to the movies on base. We took swimming lessons on base. I went to the library on base. Those are the kinds of things that we did, and that sheltered all of us, and me especially, from the realities of what was going on during that time. During my high school years, Columbia, South Carolina was a very stratified society, even in terms of the black folks who lived there. You had the professional black folk, like the teachers and the doctors and those who had white-collar jobs, and you had those who were blue-collar workers. I was sort of in between those two categories, between the blue-collar black folk and the white-collar black folk. So I didn't really identify closely with any of the children of those two groups, although I aspired and felt that I related more to the children of the professional parents at the time because of my intellectual strengths. But because my parents, with 5 children, and my mom being a homemaker, there was not the money there to allow me to do the social activity of the children whose parents were professionals. And I think that bothered me because as a child, I always wanted to do and be more than what my parents could afford. I didn't know how often that is in life that children feel that way. So I remember even going back to being 4 years old in Orangeburg, South Carolina. There was a brick AME church in front of our house, across the street from where we lived. Now, I played with a little girl there, the daughter of the minister, and I realized that she had more than I had, and I just wanted more. And as a child, not understanding the system, I always resented the fact I wanted my dad to be more than a sergeant, for example. Why aren't you an officer? That kind of thing. That was the kind of outlook I had as a child. So I sort of straddled both sets of kids in high school. But I did, as I have said, perform well academically. And so I finished in the top 5 of my class at the high school out of about 300 students there. The thing about me was that I did my work, but I was not taught or nor was I motivated to be at the very top. You know, it was something that I did naturally, whereas I understand that other kids' parents would say, oh, you have to make all A's, or if you make less than the B, it was unacceptable, you know. I always made those top grades, but it was something I did not out of competition, not out of a sense of competitiveness. During my last year of high school, my mom was approached by 2 guidance counselors who said that they had been approached by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That was started to have bright high school kids begin the process of integrating or desegregating public colleges and universities in the South, throughout the South. So my mom was approached to have me enter Winthrop University. I had wanted to go to the University of Miami, warm weather, or alternatively to Howard University, actually. But my mom explained to me that we couldn't afford to send me, although I'd gotten a small scholarship to attend Howard. The family just could not afford me my going there. So I sadly and tearfully accepted the fact that I would probably be going to Winthrop University. It was then Winthrop College. It was an honor to have been chosen to be a part of the process, the major process of desegregating schools at that time. But my classmates called me a guinea pig. I guess they didn't understand either what was happening, that this was something that needed to be done and that you had to have those parents who were willing to have their children advance the race, so to speak. My mom was a very progressive woman, having had the experience of living and interacting among others in France and being exposed to life and situations outside of small-time Orangeburg, South Carolina. So she was the head of the household. She made those kinds of decisions. I went to Winthrop, and subsequently she made the decision also to send 3 of my siblings to desegregate a high school in Columbia, South Carolina, and also an elementary school in South Carolina. So she was really at the forefront of the civil rights movement in terms of understanding that these were things that needed to be done, and she felt the value of having her children and family participate in doing so. My sister attended AC Flora High School, and I believe she was voted to be a Miss Flame. She got some kind of title there. She competed. And I don't quite remember the elementary school that my younger sister and brother desegregated there in Columbia. So, on my way to Winthrop, I was on the road with my mother and brother, my younger brother, who's 12 years younger than I. We drove the 70 miles from Columbia, South Carolina to Winthrop. Unlike students today, high school students today, we did not get to see colleges before we actually went there. So the first time I saw Winthrop was the day I arrived. That was dusk on a Sunday evening in September. And I remember pulling up to my dorm, Roddy Hall, and how intimidated I felt about the white columns that were at the front of the building. It was intimidating to me because it reminded me of the plantation homes of slave owners in the previous century. I didn't understand at the time that those columns came from Grecian history, and the Greeks took a lot of that history from Africa, from the Egyptians and the way they built buildings and that kind of thing. By the time we were in high school and I was getting ready to go to Winthrop, of course I knew the importance of taking this step to attend this college. It was not something that was dwelled on, though. You know, our parents taught us that we were as equal, as good as our white counterparts. And having had the experience of going to school with white children and assessing the situation in the classes and socially, I knew that I would do well or could do well. And I'm sure that I was chosen because I had that experience, that it was not going to be a complete culture shock for me to attend Winthrop because I'd had the experience as a young girl. But yeah, I understood peripherally what was going on. We only had one TV station that we could pick up in Columbia, South Carolina at that time. And also during that time in the South, shows were censored. If you had a black person on a TV show interacting with whites, for example, television stations would say, well, we're not going to carry the show. Leslie Uggams had her own TV show at one time. And before that, she was a guest on a particular variety show. And television stations in the South refused to show that show because Leslie Uggams was a very talented young black female singer. And that was not uncommon during that time, that Southern television stations censored shows where blacks appeared. Nat King Cole had his own show. And I would not be surprised, I haven't read this necessarily, but I believe there were in some cities, some towns where the station owners and managers refused to show Nat King Cole's show, for example. So yeah, just like now, so many of us are beginning to learn the real history of our being in this country. We are really coming to understand what systemic racism is For many of us, that's a new term. Ta-Nehisi Coates, I believe, is the writer who most recently brought that to the attention of so many Black people. How it hasn't been our fault that we have progressed in this country as many other ethnic folks have. The Italians, the Irish, the Polish, because of their white skin, they were given so many opportunities that we weren't. We were called lazy because we were seen as being poor. Oh, you're poor because you're lazy. You don't want to work. But no, all efforts were made to keep Black people down from our beginnings here in this country when we moved from indentured workers into slavery. So I think it's really only been recently that our eyes have been opened, as well as the eyes of young people, so many young people, as to what role this country has played in our enslavement and our continued repression. Even now, when you think about the Black votes in the major urban cities that are being said to have been no good, rigged, it's the Black vote that put our new president into office. It's the Black vote, Black women who were responsible for having Joe Biden even be the next president of this country. But you have this president saying, oh, we have to discount the votes in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Michigan. Those are votes by Black folk. It's not said overtly or in front of the cameras, but the ongoing oppression and suppression of our people is just so disheartening. But we have to maintain hope and take care of ourselves so we can continue the fight for fairness and equality. The killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, and the massive protests and the displays of empathy shown around the world. Hopefully, those experiences, sports players putting names on the back of their uniforms, the major corporations taking steps to acknowledge the suffering that we've gone through. I think being exposed to that, I think, makes 20-year-olds more aware of our history, more aware of our place in society, and more understanding of what we have to overcome still to enjoy the good life that we see others around us having. A big difference back then, but I've subsequently learned that there were high school students who did participate in sit-ins at lunch counters and that kind of thing. It was just that I wasn't aware of it. But yeah, and other parents, of course, who had lived in Columbia or in South Carolina for most of their lives, they were more tuned in to what was going on and participated in acts of defiance of the segregated laws that we had to undergo at that time. So my mom and brother dropped me off at the Roddy Hall. It was dusk, and so I was left in my dim dorm room, and the separation was a bit difficult, as it would be for any first-time student going off to college in a different place. What happened though at Winthrop was that Roddy Hall has some suites. And so I was placed in a suite. I had a room to myself. And on the other side of our bathroom, there was another suite where Arnetta Gladden, the other student who joined me at Winthrop that first year, she lived. We were placed in suites so that we would not have to shower in common with the other girls. And that was the first step in basically the decision on the part of college administrators to isolate us. And that sense of isolation followed us throughout our years in college, those of us who were the first there. It followed us because we could not identify with the girls. The white girls on campus couldn't identify with us. We were there. They were living their full campus experiences. We were not. We basically went to class, came back, and socialized among ourselves, as it were. On the weekends, however, when the boys from Clemson or the University of South Carolina would come to visit, that was when we were stared at, made fun of. The boys were aggressive in their viewing of us, and whereas the girls just went about their business, and if they didn't share any overt kind of racism that we could see or that I could personally see. But it was a different story when those boys came on campus. And I remember one time the boys were making fun and staring at us so much that, in those days, the Supremes were very popular. So I recall that the three of us struck a pose, like we were just the Supremes. Well, since you're looking, let us show you something to look at. My professors were professional. I didn't feel a sense of racism from them. I didn't get that experience from them. I, for the most part, enjoyed my classes. I did not like getting up early. And so, unfortunately, I remember mainly my French classes, I would be dozing off. But it did make a difference because I'd had that experience in France. I had an ear for the language. I had really just organically moved into choosing French as my major. That was what I knew. We weren't exposed to many other job or career paths at that time. Most Black people were teachers or doctors, very few doctors, but the majority of professional people at that time when I was growing up were teachers mainly. And so we were kind of limited in exposure as to what opportunities were out there for us to follow. And so because of that, I chose French. I did well in French. And when I graduated from Winthrop, I received a Fulbright Hays Fellowship to study for 1 year at the University of Nice in France. I felt that was my reward for having to go through 4 years of isolation, 4 years of not having the college experience that I would have had I gone to Howard University, for example. The socialization there was stunted. It was an all-girls school, so there was not the growth in socialization and maturity that one achieves in experiencing life on a historically Black college or university. Looking back on those Winthrop days and our experiences there, we really very much were stuck on campus. There was not much to do in Rock Hill. There was not much of a downtown. We would occasionally visit Arnetta Gladden's home. She was a Rock Hill native, but that was it. We, through her friends in town, some of them, we went on dates with local boys, and not far away from the campus was, I guess you'd call it a juke joint, called the Shack. And we would hang out there on weekends, which was just gave us some relief. I was looking back. One year I spent off campus, across from the campus, in the French house. French majors could go there, and the idea was that you would communicate with each other in French. So I was looking at a book where the girls had to put down, if they left the French house, they would have to put down what time they left, where they were going, and who they were going with. What a difference from today. The isolation that took place on campus for the first of us there was complete. We did, however, have a relationship with some older white senior girls who were part of the Methodist Student Center. A few of them sort of took us under their wings. They had cars, and they sort of showed us around town, or took us out on occasion just to get away from campus and to give us a feeling of acceptance. That was the only outreach from students that we received while we're on campus. I guess I was a little different again because of my prior experiences. I was not afraid to do things that the other girls would not do. For example, when I lived in the French house, I said, I'm going to get me a bicycle. And so you saw me on campus riding back and forth. And actually the other black girls were sort of tickled at me, because they couldn't see themselves on a bicycle riding back and forth on campus. So that was one of the things I did that stood out a bit. I also decided, after listening to the Nashville stations late at night, where you had Aretha Franklin and the Temptations and Otis Redding playing at night, I said, hey, I want to do that on campus. We had a campus radio station called WCRO. So I had the grand idea that I was going to play music on the station so that we could hear. So I did that for a while. I was also vice president of the Phi Kappa Phi Honor Society. Because of the grades I received at Winthrop, I was an honorary marshal. I think it was Tillman Hall, maybe, where all the concerts were held on campus. So we wore white dresses with sashes. I was the only black girl participating in that. And just other honorary society things that I was a part of. Voted to who's who among colleges and universities. Those were honors that sort of made up for the lack of socialization that otherwise I would have probably participated in. I don't know. Looking back on my life, I think that, in a sense, things are placed before you. And there are some things you don't really have a choice about based on maybe your personality even. I think I was termed an introvert, and I hated that term. And I think a lot of that might have to do with genetics, family, just a family outlook, And I think my brother and my sister, both of them said they were introverts. But I hated that title. I hated being called quiet. I think if I had stayed in Orangeburg, I would have been that mischievous, outgoing child that I started out being, But I think that it was because of my personality type. It might have been better for me to be at Winthrop at an all-girls school before I got out into the world. But later on, when I finished Winthrop and had attended the University of Nice in France and returned to the States, my roommate was in grad school at Howard University, so I got to get some of that culture that I missed earlier. But in France, at the University of Nice, we were on the French Riviera. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to meet students from Africa, Black students from the Caribbean. And it was such a wonderful, affirming opportunity to see others from around the world and to see how they lived and see how they viewed life. That was a good experience for me. And while I was there, a friend and I from Oklahoma, a girl from Oklahoma, we hitchhiked through southern France, Spain, Portugal, and went on even to the Rock of Gibraltar and went from there to Morocco during spring break. So those were eye-opening adventures for me. Moving to France during that period of time, there was not the kind of fear, the kind of crime and so on and so forth that we have around the world now, perhaps even more so in this country. So that was a popular thing to do, to hitchhike. But we took precautions. We started out with 3 of us girls, and we couldn't. 3 girls were too much, so 1 girl had to go back to the university. So we always said that we would not get in a car or a vehicle with more than 1 person. It was mostly guys who picked us up. We would not get in a car if there were 2 men in there, for example. So that was helpful. I just remember one experience where one guy seemed crazy, but because we outnumbered him, we got out as soon as we could, but that was not problematic. When we reached Morocco, however, there weren't many cars on the roads in Morocco, and nobody stopped to pick us up. One car, a huge Mercedes-Benz with a lot of Arab men with their headgear, stopped and asked us if we wanted a ride. We said no, thank you. The car was full of men, and that was not going to be safe for us. So there was never the fear of being, of having something done to us as we were hitchhiking. And I remember being in Portugal. My companion was a white girl, and in Portugal, walking and about, we were at one little village, and guess what? The little brown-skinned children there, darker hued, being in Portugal and having the black influence there from centuries ago, they pointed at me and said, "Hey, Lola Falana, Lola Falana." Lola Falana was a famous black dancer during the time who dated Sammy Davis Jr. So they thought I was Lola Falana. That was a good experience. Oh, you think I'm Lola Falana? That was an amusing experience. But the experience in France was good because of the travel that I was able to do, and because of my experience of meeting other students, in particular African and Caribbean students. Being a Fulbright Hays Scholar was an honor because we were chosen to actually represent the United States in other countries. So we were ambassadors in a sense. So that was a rewarding experience as well. One summer at Winthrop, I decided to be a camp counselor, and I was based in Brooklyn, New York. In Brooklyn, New York, I took the children around the city by way of subway to various places. And one of the places we visited was the City College of New York. I mistakenly thought Columbia University was the City College of New York. Anyway, so I knew I was going to go to grad school. So I applied to Columbia University and was accepted before I even went to France. So coming back from France, I decided I also needed to get some work experience. So I worked as an intern at a radio station in New York City. And I got that job because when I graduated from Winthrop and got that Fulbright Hays Fellowship, I received letters from the Daughters of the American Revolution and both Senators Strom Thurmond and Hollings at the time. And in the letter from Hollings, he said to me, "Contact me if you ever need anything." Well, in Washington, D.C., living with an aunt and trying to find a job, I really didn't even know how to look for a job because I had never had experience of working before. So my mom again stepped up and said, "Well, why don't you contact Senator Hollings' office?" So I did, and someone in his office called me back and tried to get from me an idea of what I might want to do. And I told him that I liked radio. I had done work at a radio station on campus, so I got that job. And I worked in Washington, D.C. for a year at the station out of Silver Springs, Maryland. They offered me a job when I was done, but I knew I was going on to graduate school. I'd been accepted in grad facs at Columbia University for French literature. And so when I declined that job, I then, during the summer, worked for the Washington baseball team, the Washington Senators, traveling back and forth from Northwest D.C., passing by the White House every day, going to the baseball stadium in Northeast D.C. And that was a good experience for me also. I mean, I took so much for granted, passing all these monuments and buildings in D.C. I had a little Carmen Ghia convertible at that time, soft top convertible. So you saw me riding around town in that little convertible going back and forth to work. So anyway, I worked for a year, went to Columbia University and did grad facs, studying French literature for a year, decided that I did not want to teach or on any level. So some of my friends were in the School of Journalism there, and having heard from them about their experiences in the school, and having been told in high school that I was a good writer by my English teacher, I decided to apply for the journalism school. I got into the journalism school. I had a broadcast concentration, and after that worked in journalism in the city for a few years at a couple of radio stations there, and ended up at the CBS Radio Network, where my fondest memory while I was there was meeting Dan Rather, the famous Dan Rather. He was such a nice man. He reached out to little old me and actually made conversation with me. That was the type of guy he was, down to earth, and not an elitist, you know. Stint in journalism in New York City followed. I don't believe I was really cut out for the cutthroat business of broadcast journalism. So I left and took a job teaching journalism at Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina. Then basically returning to New York City, because I taught at Benedict for 3 years. I re-entered broadcast journalism as anchor and broadcast reporter at the NBC affiliate in Columbia before moving on back to New York City. So we decided that New York City would be a hard place, difficult place to raise a child. And through a friend of his, he went to visit Key West, Florida. Completely different, right? We were getting tired of only having 2 months of warm weather in New York City. He came back fascinated with Key West. And so I said, okay, well, why don't we move to Key West? And that's what we did. We separated. I moved back to Columbia, South Carolina, so that Vashti would get to know her people, her relatives. Vashti decided she wanted to come to Charlotte to go to school because she didn't want to go far away from home. I wanted her to have some experience at a large university, something like that, outside of the South. But she decided to come to Charlotte. For 10 years after we moved from Key West, Florida, I'd worked in my family business, our family business. My mom started a wholesale bakery. The only black wholesale bakery, I believe, definitely in South Carolina and in the South. And she was so enterprising that she got all of our cakes into military bases around the country. We were in grocery stores in South Carolina, Piggly Wiggly, Bilo. We were in, at the peak, 55 grocery stores in the South. And so I was basically the company's representative in that I had to go into these stores, introduce our product, and then follow up in delivering cakes and that kind of thing. And I did that for 10 years. My mom passed away. My sister had a stroke, so the business declined. At that time, I decided to move in 2004 to Charlotte, never having really been comfortable in South Carolina anyway. I returned there for the sake of my daughter. So when she moved to Charlotte, having only one child, I decided to follow her here. Now, what is that biblical expression? And the child shall lead the way, or something like that. And that's what she did for me. So when I followed her here to Charlotte, I lived with her and her roommate for a year and a half. I wrote for the Charlotte Observer, covering Huntersville and writing some feature articles before I decided that I wanted to return to my first love, which is teaching French. And so I did that for 7 years in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. While here, I just felt Charlotte was a place where I could settle down and make a home for myself. And that's what I did, because so many parts of Charlotte reminded me of places I'd lived. Some parts of Charlotte reminded me of Columbia, South Carolina. Some parts of Charlotte reminded me of Washington, D.C. Some parts of Charlotte reminded me of Key West, Florida. So I felt at home here, and I feel at home here, and purchased a home here. Became involved in civic organizations such as the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women's Clubs. Became involved in that organization. Did some innovative things with that organization, adopting a neighborhood, for example. We did that kind of outreach. I was the communications director for the organization. I was a Founders Day committee chair for the organization. Those kinds of things. And out of being a part of that group, I met T.D. Elder, well-known civic leader here in Charlotte. She introduced me to the League of Women Voters. I attended some meetings, at first because of the lack of color, let us put it that way. lack of color in the organization, I really didn't feel comfortable. But I got involved thanks to the membership chair who embraced me, and as a result, I decided to remain in the organization. Because of my journalism background, I became the director of our debates on WTVR television station, the public television station. We, at the time that I joined, all the debates, the local politicians debated the public television station, because basically the county paid for the production costs, so which was a good public service. But because Dina DiOrio decided after a point, well, why should the county pay for these debates on TV when nobody else is chipping in? The Board of Education and the city of Charlotte, So that was discontinued. But that was a good experience, meeting the politicians, devising questions for them, just directing that whole process. T.D. Elder introduced me to the League of Women Voters, and it took me a great deal of thought, because there was a lack of diversity in the League of Women Voters, and still is to a great extent. So I joined the League in 2014, became active, as I said, with the televised debates, also led an effort to discuss a living wage back before it became so popular. And we got a lot of press coverage working with the North Carolina Justice Center to talk about the necessity of being able to live in this rich country and not be paid $7.25 an hour for the work you're doing. So in the course of being on the board, the president of the league at that time decided she was going to resign because of a conflict with other board members. Because of my role and my strong voice and my position on where the league should go as a member of the board, for example, I recommended who should be the interim president, and that was accepted. Just presenting a strong opinion, a strong face, and being progressive about where I thought the league would go, not thinking about taking on the role of president. I was recruited to be president of the league, and so I accepted and have served in that capacity for the past 5 years. It will have been 5 years when I leave the position in June 2021. And I will have been one of the longest serving presidents in the history of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg League once I leave. My goal as president of the league was to expose the league more in the city and county, to give it more visibility. So I started out with entering the league in parades. I had been to the Martin Luther King Jr. parade in January one year, and I saw all of the organizations that were taking part. And so I said, hey, let's do this. Let's get out and be in the parades, the major parades in the city. So that's what we did. Did more press releases, with what we were doing, sending it out to media. I decided to have a program in the evening for those league members who work during the day. So we have currently a lunch with the league and league talk. Those programs are presented every other month, one during the day and the other in the evening. A collaboration with other organizations is also an approach that I took on. For example, back in 2018, I gathered together 15 other women's organizations to put on 3 forums around women's issues. And that that started a collaboration with other women's organizations that the League had not really kindled in the past. I think the fact that one League member said to me, "Delores, you don't seem to be afraid." And that's been my approach. If you believe something, strongly support it. Don't be afraid to speak out on the issues you firmly believe in. And that's been my approach, and I think that is what led to my leading the League. Also, when I leave in June, I will have earned for the League, this local League, more funds than any other president, because we had a fantastic gala back in February of this year. It seems so long ago, but it was such a well-received function, and we raised quite a bit of money with the 100th anniversary celebration of the League of Women Voters. And that was a chore for me. But through persistence and through bringing on board one woman in particular with a lot of social capital here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, she was able to bring on many of her wealthy friends to help make the function a success. Outreach to other Black organizations was also something I tried to do, which is hard because Black female organizations, sororities, for example, they have their own thing, so to speak. They're very, very much caught up and involved in the functioning of the sororities. So they're not necessarily going to join an all-white organization of white females. And so whereas that outreach was made, not as successful as it could have been. Also reaching out to the Social Justice Committee at Friendship to partner with them with doing forums the past 2 years, 2019, 2020, because in producing the forums for the coalition of the female organizations, I just said, we need to give these politicians a break. They're running from one place to the other place. Why can't we, as organizations, get together to have them all in one place and still produce the same results? So that is the kind of outreach I've made as president. In particular, in this past year, a number of national organizations have reached out. Having done an interview with Ms. Magazine, the University of California reached out for an interview, did an interview with a filmmaker that should be airing sometime in the coming year. Those are things I've done, I think, to help promote this Charlotte League. When I finished teaching for 7 years French in the CMS school system, I said, okay, I need to let folks know more about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and what that organization did to desegregate public colleges and universities in the South. So I reached out to the NAACP, had a hard time getting through. When the head of the organization came here to Charlotte a few years back, I spoke to her about it. I understand that they don't know where the records might be and who might have gained from getting scholarships through that organization. So that's a project I'm going to work on. I'll go to the headquarters and see what I can dig up, because they reached out to me even after I graduated from Winthrop. They paid for my full 4 years at Winthrop University. And I was in the first class of students who were recruited to desegregate these schools and colleges. And I don't know if you know Harvey Gantt, the former mayor of Charlotte, was also in that first class of students who received this NAACP Legal Defense Fund scholarship to attend Clemson. So what I'd like to do is do research on that and contact those of us who are still here. I mean, it should have been done sooner, but that's one of the projects that I plan to work on once I leave the league. I'd also like to look more into my family roots in Orangeburg, South Carolina. That connection has really been lacking in my life. And so I'd like to make those connections and perhaps write about my family and my life and that kind of thing. I plan to stay connected, stay involved with the league. I think that will be a lifelong gift to myself, to stay connected with the league. I really very much believe in, and I think I've been asked to serve on the state board, but I think I might be more interested in serving on the national level, and I will pursue that. They have been asking league presidents to look into that, so I'll look into that to see about serving on a national board, especially since we now have our second black president of the National League in its 100-year history. So I'm going to do that. Also, I'm just going to take time out for myself. Being the leader of the league is a full-time job. And that's what it's been for me, more than a full-time job. So I'm just going to take some time with me, hopes this COVID lets up so I can do more traveling. So those are my plans for the future. I've always been a person who just can't relax. I mean, I just can't sit still. I have to find something that I feel is constructive to do. I feel guilty even on my days off that I'm thinking, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to do something? I need to check the calendar, et cetera, et cetera. Reading is a great hobby of mine. I look forward to reading President Barack Obama's book. I have to order that and make that a Christmas gift to myself. The only thing about reading is that when I pick up a book, I don't want to put it down. So that's problematic for me. You asked me if I were an activist, and I would say I am an active by the mere fact that I am leading this really prestigious organization, this well-respected organization. Oftentimes people think of an activist as being a person who's out in the street protesting, but you can be an activist in so many ways. You can be an activist for advocating for civil rights, for human rights, for voting rights. And you can do that by informing people, informing the public, going to court, as the league has done very frequently to stop voter suppression. I'll say specifically here in this state, because North Carolina has been at the forefront of suppressing the black vote. So yes, in that sense, you may not see me out on the street marching, which I have done in the past in South Carolina, for example, to bring that Confederate flag down. But you may see me speaking before city councilors, speaking before the county commissioner, speaking before the Board of Education, going up to Raleigh to advocate for certain issues that we believe in. Medicaid expansion, more funds for education. Those are the kinds of advocacy issues that I feel makes me an activist. The ability to live a good life while we're on earth. Do not have so many people struggle while they're living. I think in this country we've taken a big step forward, having a black female being the next vice president. I think we as black people and as black women deserve to have that position in place for us. But at the same time, we need to make sure that she's not a figurehead. And we have to keep on pushing for those issues that are important, not only to black people, but for everybody. You know what I'm saying? The wealthy cannot just always control what's happening in this country in terms of wages, in terms of education, in terms of spreading the wealth. And I think that the future really does lie with young people. I think their eyes are open more than my generation's eyes were, for example, in particular, in my case. And I think moving forward, we're going to have to rely on you guys to pick up the ball and keep the progress moving. But the benefit of having the last 4 years of this particular president is that the colorful quilt that is America, that quilt has been jerked back. I mean, we see now really what this country is. We see that we have a long road ahead in terms of changing people's mindsets, changing the mindsets of people who really don't want to change, But I think that we can't live without hope. We can't dissolve into despair, and that we just keep looking forward, knowing and learning more about our history, being prayerful. I think believing in a higher power always helps us not to be self-centered and selfish. And from that point of view, I think that we're going to continue to march and move ahead.